28 years ago, on June 27, 1995, Jodi Huisentruit was supposed to be the familiar face greeting Mason City, Iowa, with the morning news. The 27-year-old anchor for KIMT TV had built a reputation as one of the most beloved journalists in the region. Her infectious smile and genuine warmth made her a household name across northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. She was young, ambitious, and living her dream. But that morning, something went terribly wrong. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. At 4:10 a.m., Jodi's producer John Vansis called her apartment after she failed to show up for her 6 a.m. newscast. This was completely unlike Jodi. She was known for her professionalism and reliability. When he reached her by phone, Jodi sounded groggy and admitted she had overslept. She promised to be at the station immediately. It was a brief conversation that would haunt Vansis for decades to come. 20 minutes later, at 4:30 a.m., neighbors in Jodi's apartment complex reported hearing a woman scream, followed by what sounded like a struggle. The sounds came from the direction of the parking lot where Jodi's red Mazda Miata was parked. But in the pre-dawn darkness, no one investigated further. No one called the police. It was a decision that would forever change the course of this case. When Jodi never arrived at the television station, her colleagues grew increasingly worried. KIMT management tried calling her apartment repeatedly, but there was no answer. By 7 a.m., they made the decision that would alert the entire community that something was wrong. They announced on air that Jodi Huisentruit was missing and asked anyone with information to come forward. The Mason City Police Department was contacted shortly after the broadcast. When officers arrived at Jodi's apartment complex on Key Heights Drive, they discovered a scene that would become etched in the minds of investigators forever. Jodi's red Mazda Miata sat in the parking lot, its driver's side door ajar. Her high heels lay scattered on the asphalt nearby. Her car keys were found underneath the vehicle, along with a bent keychain and what appeared to be pieces of a palm-sized object. The evidence painted a chilling picture. Jodi had made it to her car, but never made it inside. Something had happened in those precious few moments between her apartment door and her vehicle. Something that would launch one of Iowa's most intensive missing person investigations and leave a family shattered by the unknown. Detective Ron Vander Weerd, who would become the lead investigator on the case, later described the scene as clearly indicating a struggle. But despite the obvious signs of foul play, crucial evidence was already being compromised. The parking lot wasn't immediately secured as a crime scene, allowing residents and curious onlookers to walk through the area before forensic experts could properly examine every detail. Jodi's disappearance sent shockwaves through Mason City, a town of about 30,000 people where violent crime was rare. She wasn't just a local news anchor. She was a friend, a familiar face who had become part of people's daily routines. The community rallied immediately, organizing search parties and posting flyers with Jodi's smiling face throughout the region. But as the hours turned into days, and the days turned into weeks, it became clear that whoever had taken Jodi had vanished just as completely as she had. The investigation was entering uncharted territory, and the Huisentruit family's nightmare was just beginning. Jodi Sue Huisentruit had always been destined for something special. Born in Long Prairie, Minnesota, on June 5, 1968, she grew up in a close-knit family that valued hard work, integrity, and community service. Her parents, Maurice and Joanne Huisentruit, raised Jodi and her siblings with strong Midwest values that would define her character throughout her life. From an early age, Jodi displayed the charisma and determination that would later make her a natural on television. She was a star athlete at Long Prairie High School, excelling in golf, basketball, and track. But it was her participation in speech and drama that hinted at her future career path. Teachers and classmates remember her as someone who could command a room with her presence, while still maintaining a genuine warmth that made everyone feel included. After graduating high school in 1986, Jodi pursued her passion for journalism at St. Cloud State University. She threw herself into campus media, working for both the student newspaper and the campus television station. Her professors noted her exceptional work ethic and natural ability to connect with interview subjects. She had that rare combination of professionalism and approachability that viewers would later come to love. During her college years, Jodi developed the personality traits that would define her professional success. She was known for remembering personal details about everyone she met, from the campus janitor to the university president. This wasn't a calculated career move. It was simply who Jodi was. She genuinely cared about people, and it showed in everything she did. After graduating from St. Cloud State in 1990, with a degree in speech communication, Jodi began her broadcasting career at KGAN TV in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She started as a producer, but quickly moved in front of the camera as a weekend anchor and reporter. Her talent was undeniable, and within a few years she had caught the attention of Kim T TV in Mason City. In 1993, Kim T offered Jodi the position she had always dreamed of, morning news anchor for their Daybreak program. At just 25 years old, she was living her professional dream in a market that appreciated her skills. Mason City embraced their new morning anchor immediately. Jodi didn't just read the news, she became part of the community fabric. She volunteered for local charities, attended community events, and made genuine connections with viewers who would stop her on the street to chat about everything from the weather forecast to their grandchildren. Jodi had a gift for making people feel seen and heard, whether they were watching her on television or meeting her at the grocery store. Her colleagues at KMT described her as the heart of the newsroom. She was always willing to stay late to help a co-worker finish a story, or come in early to cover for someone who was sick. Despite being one of the station's most recognizable personalities, Jodi never acted like a prima donna. She was as comfortable interviewing the mayor as she was covering a local high school basketball game. But Jodi's life wasn't just about work. She maintained close relationships with her family back in Long Prairie, calling home regularly and visiting whenever her schedule allowed. She dated, though she hadn't found someone special enough to settle down with. She had a wide circle of friends who knew her as loyal, fun-loving, and always up for an adventure. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Jodi seemed to be at the peak of her personal and professional life. She had just returned from a vacation to Mexico with friends and was excited about potential career opportunities that might take her to larger markets. She had recently moved into her apartment on Key Heights Drive and was looking forward to what the future might hold. Those who knew Jodi best said she had everything to live for. She was young, successful, and surrounded by people who cared about her. The idea that someone would want to harm this bright, caring woman seemed incomprehensible to everyone who knew her. But as the investigation would soon reveal, even the most innocent lives can intersect with dangerous people in ways no one could predict. The Mason City Police Department had never handled a case like this. In a town where the most serious crimes typically involved domestic disputes or petty theft, the apparent abduction of a beloved television personality was completely outside their experience. But they threw every available resource into finding Jodi Huisentruit. Detective Ron van der Weerd was assigned as the lead investigator, and he approached the case with the methodical determination that would define the investigation for years to come. Within hours of discovering Jodi's abandoned car, law enforcement had established a command center and begun interviewing everyone who knew her. The initial investigation focused on the most obvious possibilities. Had Jodi been the victim of a random crime? Was this a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was someone specifically targeting her? The evidence at the scene suggested this wasn't a robbery gone wrong, Jodi's purse was still in her apartment, and there was no sign that anyone had tried to steal her car. Investigators immediately began interviewing Jodi's colleagues at KIMT. They learned about her normal routine, her work schedule, and any recent stories she had covered that might have made her enemies. As a morning anchor, Jodi typically covered lighter news, community events, human interest stories, and local happenings. She wasn't an investigative reporter digging into controversial topics that might have made someone want to silence her. The timeline of that morning was reconstructed minute by minute. Jodi had left work around 10:30 p.m. on June 26th after anchoring the evening newscast. She went to dinner with a friend, then home to her apartment. The last confirmed sighting of her was around 11:30 p.m. when a neighbor saw her parking her car and walking to her apartment door. The phone call from producer John Van Cise at 4:10 a.m. established that Jodi was alive at that time. But something had happened in the 20 minutes between that call and when neighbors reported hearing screams. 20 minutes that would become the most crucial and mysterious window in the entire case. Investigators canvassed the apartment complex and surrounding neighborhood, looking for anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. The responses were frustratingly sparse. A few residents reported hearing what might have been a scream around 4:30 a.m., but no one had looked outside or called police. In the pre-dawn darkness, no one had seen any suspicious vehicles or individuals. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of day or night these documented reports reach. The physical evidence from the scene was sent to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Crime Lab for analysis. Jodi's car was processed for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and any other clues that might identify her abductor. The scattered high heels were examined, along with the bent keychain and mysterious fragments found under the vehicle. Within 48 hours of Jodi's disappearance, the FBI joined the investigation. The case had all the hallmarks of a federal crime, possible kidnapping across state lines. Special Agent Gary Brindley was assigned to work alongside local investigators, bringing federal resources and expertise to bear on the case. The media attention was immediate and intense. Jodi's disappearance became front-page news, not just in Iowa, but across the Midwest. National news outlets picked up the story of the missing television anchor, and soon Jodi's face was appearing on news broadcasts far beyond Mason City. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A woman who had made her career delivering the news had become the news in the most tragic way possible. Jodi's family arrived in Mason City as soon as they heard about her disappearance. Her parents, Maurice and Joanne, were devastated but determined to do everything possible to find their daughter. They worked closely with investigators, providing detailed information about Jodi's habits, relationships, and any recent concerns she might have mentioned. The family also became advocates for the investigation, speaking to media outlets and appealing for public help. They established a reward fund and worked with law enforcement to coordinate volunteer search efforts. The Huisentruit family's dignity and determination in the face of unimaginable uncertainty became a source of inspiration for the entire community. As the investigation expanded, one name began to surface repeatedly in witness interviews: John Van Cise, the KIMT producer who had made the fateful phone call that morning. While investigators stressed that he was being interviewed as a witness, not a suspect, his close relationship with Jodi began to attract scrutiny. Van Cise, who was significantly older than Jodi, had been mentioned by several people as someone who seemed to have more than just professional interest in the missing anchor. But even as investigators explored every lead, the case began to reveal the complex web of relationships that surrounded Jodi Huisentruit. What had initially appeared to be the random abduction of an innocent young woman was becoming something far more complicated and disturbing. John Van Cise, the 50-year-old KIMT producer who had called Jodi that morning, quickly became the focus of intense scrutiny. Colleagues at the station began sharing details about his relationship with Jodi that painted a troubling picture. While Vancis maintained that he and Jodi were simply friends and colleagues, others described his behavior toward her as obsessive and inappropriate. Several KIMT employees told investigators that Vancis seemed to have an unhealthy fixation on Jodi. He would frequently find excuses to be near her workspace, often lingering at her desk long after work-related conversations had ended. He had given her expensive gifts that seemed far beyond what would be appropriate between colleagues, including jewelry that Jodi had privately expressed discomfort about accepting. More disturbing were reports that Vancis had been seen following Jodi's car after work on multiple occasions. When confronted about this by other employees, he would claim he was just concerned about her safety or heading in the same direction. But his explanations didn't satisfy those who witnessed his behavior. The investigation also revealed that on the night before Jodi's disappearance, she had attended a birthday party for a friend. Vancis had shown up uninvited to this private gathering, claiming he had heard about it and thought it would be fun to join. Witnesses at the party described his behavior as strange and possessive. He had attempted to monopolize Jodi's attention throughout the evening, becoming visibly agitated when she talked to other men at the party. Perhaps most significantly, several people reported that Jodi had recently expressed concerns about Vancis's behavior. She had confided to close friends that she felt uncomfortable with his attention and was considering talking to management about it. One friend later told investigators that Jodi had used the word stalking to describe Vancis's behavior, though she hadn't yet decided whether to file a formal complaint. When investigators brought Vancis in for questioning, his story began to shift in subtle but important ways. Initially, he claimed that his phone call to Jodi that morning was routine, just a producer checking on a missing anchor. But under pressure, he admitted that he had been trying to reach Jodi multiple times that night and early morning, not just the one call he had initially reported. Phone records supported this revelation, showing that Vancis had called Jodi's apartment several times between midnight and 4 a.m. When asked to explain these calls, Vancis became evasive, claiming he had been worried about her after she seemed tired at work the previous day. His explanations were unconvincing to investigators who were beginning to see a pattern of obsessive behavior. Even more troubling was the discovery that Vancis had a key to Jodi's apartment. He claimed she had given it to him so he could feed her cat when she was out of town, but friends and family members had never heard Jodi mention this arrangement. Her parents were particularly disturbed by this revelation, as Jodi had never mentioned giving anyone a key to her home. The investigation took another dark turn when investigators learned about Vancis's previous relationships. They discovered a pattern of behavior with younger women that mirrored his interactions with Jodi. Former girlfriends described him as charming initially, but increasingly controlling and jealous as relationships progressed. One woman had filed a restraining order against him several years earlier, though the details remained sealed in court records. Despite the mounting suspicions about Vancis, investigators were careful not to focus exclusively on him. They continued to explore other possibilities, including the theory that Jodi might have been the victim of a stranger abduction. The FBI brought in behavioral analysts who created a profile of the likely perpetrator based on the evidence at the scene. The profile suggested someone who knew Jodi's routine and had been watching her for some time. The precise timing of the attack, just as she was leaving for work at an unusual time due to oversleeping, suggested someone who was monitoring her movements closely. This supported the theory that Jodi's abduction was personal rather than random. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to consume massive resources. The Mason City Police Department was working around the clock, following up on hundreds of tips from the public. The FBI had assigned multiple agents to the case, and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation was providing ongoing support. Search teams scoured every inch of northern Iowa and southern Minnesota, looking for any trace of Jodi or evidence of what had happened to her. Volunteers organized massive ground searches, while law enforcement used helicopters, boats, and trained search dogs to cover areas that might contain clues. The media attention continued to be intense, with national news programs regularly updating their coverage of the case. America's Most Wanted featured Jodi's disappearance, generating hundreds of new tips that investigators had to evaluate and follow up on. Each lead brought new hope that breakthrough might be imminent, but each one ultimately led to another dead end. For Jodi's family, the uncertainty was becoming unbearable. They had set up a temporary residence in Mason City to be close to the investigation, but the constant stress of not knowing what had happened to their daughter was taking a devastating toll. Maurice and Joanne Huisentruit aged years in a matter of months, their faces showing the strain of living in limbo between hope and despair. The community's response had been overwhelming in its support, but even that began to change as the investigation dragged on without results. Some residents grew frustrated with the continued media attention, while others began to whisper their own theories about what might have happened to Jodi. The unity that had initially characterized Mason City's response to the tragedy was beginning to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. As the investigation stretched into its second year, Mason City found itself transformed from a quiet Midwest community into the subject of national scrutiny. The constant presence of media trucks, FBI agents, and curious onlookers had fundamentally changed the character of the town. What had begun as a unified effort to find Jodi Huisentruit was evolving into something more complex and troubling. The intense focus on John Van Cees had created divisions within the community. While some residents were convinced of his guilt based on the mounting circumstantial evidence, others defended him as a grieving colleague who was being unfairly targeted. Van Cees continued to work at KIMT, though his relationship with other staff members had become increasingly strained. The ongoing investigation had also begun to reveal other secrets about life in Mason City. As FBI agents interviewed hundreds of residents, they uncovered a network of relationships and rivalries that painted a more complex picture of the seemingly innocent community. There were reports of affairs, financial improprieties, and other scandals that had nothing to do with Jodi's disappearance, but added to the atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust. One particular revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Investigators discovered that several prominent Mason City residents had been involved in activities that they had worked hard to keep secret. While these activities weren't necessarily criminal, they created a web of people who had reasons to avoid police scrutiny. This discovery led investigators to consider whether Jodi might have inadvertently stumbled upon information that someone wanted to keep hidden. As a local news anchor, she would have had access to gossip and information that others might consider dangerous. Perhaps her disappearance wasn't about a stalker's obsession, but about silencing someone who knew too much. The theory gained credibility when investigators learned that Jodi had been working on a story about local corruption in the weeks before her disappearance. While the story had never been broadcast, she had been conducting interviews and gathering information about irregularities in city government contracts. The story had been put on hold when Jodi's news director decided it needed more investigation before airing. Several people who had spoken to Jodi about the corruption story reported that she had seemed excited about the potential impact of her reporting. She had told one source that she believed the story could change everything about how business was conducted in Mason City. But she had also mentioned feeling pressure from management to drop the story, suggesting that not everyone wanted her investigation to continue. This new avenue of investigation led FBI agents to examine Jodi's computer and personal files more closely. They discovered notes and documents related to the corruption story that revealed the scope of her investigation. Jodi had uncovered evidence of a bid-rigging scheme involving several city contracts, with indications that the corruption extended to law enforcement and other city departments. The implications were staggering. If Jodi had been killed to prevent her from exposing this corruption, it would mean that her murder was connected to some of Mason City's most prominent citizens. The investigation suddenly had to consider the possibility that the very people who were publicly calling for justice in Jodi's case might have been involved in her disappearance. This revelation also cast new doubt on the police investigation itself. If members of the Mason City Police Department were involved in the corruption that Jodi was investigating, could they be trusted to solve her disappearance? The FBI took a more prominent role in the case, quietly beginning to investigate some of the same people who had been helping with the search for Jodi. As these new theories emerged, John Vancis's role in the case became even more mysterious. Investigators discovered that he had connections to several of the people involved in the corruption scheme. While there was no evidence that he was directly involved in any illegal activities, his relationships raised questions about whether his obsession with Jodi might have been motivated by more than romantic interest. The investigation also revealed that Vancis had been in significant financial trouble in the months before Jodi's disappearance. He owed money to several creditors and was facing the possibility of losing his home. Some investigators theorized that he might have been pressured by the corruption ring to help silence Jodi in exchange for financial relief. But despite these new theories and the mounting circumstantial evidence, investigators still lacked the proof they needed to make an arrest. Without Jodi's body or definitive physical evidence linking anyone to her disappearance, the case remained frustratingly unsolved. The stress was taking its toll on everyone involved in the investigation. Detective Ron Van de Weerd had become personally invested in solving the case, working 18-hour days and following up on every possible lead. But the lack of progress was wearing him down, and he was beginning to face criticism from some community members who felt the police weren't doing enough. The FBI agents assigned to the case were equally frustrated. They had interviewed hundreds of witnesses, analyzed thousands of pieces of evidence, and followed leads across multiple states. But Jodi Huisentruit had simply vanished as completely as if she had never existed. For Jodi's family, the new theories about corruption and conspiracy provided both hope and additional anguish. On one hand, it suggested that there might be a rational explanation for her disappearance, something more substantial than the random act of violence they had initially feared. But it also meant that powerful people with significant resources might be working to ensure that the truth never came to light. The family had hired their own private investigator to work alongside law enforcement, but even this additional resource hadn't yielded the breakthrough they desperately needed. They continued to make public appeals for information, but the response was diminishing as the case grew older and other news stories captured public attention. The second anniversary of Jodi's disappearance approached with no resolution in sight. The investigation had consumed enormous resources and generated thousands of pages of reports, but it had failed to answer the most basic question: what had happened to Jodi Huisentruit? By 1998, 3 years after Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance, the case had officially gone cold. The initial surge of tips and leads had dwindled to a trickle, and the FBI had reassigned most of its agents to other cases. The Mason City Police Department continued to work the case, but with limited resources and no new evidence, progress had ground to a halt. If this case has already captured your attention, please leave a like. It helps Jodi Huisentruit's story reach more people. The passage of time had changed everything about the investigation. Witnesses' memories had faded, and some had moved away from Mason City, making follow-up interviews difficult or impossible. Physical evidence from the scene had been analyzed and reanalyzed, But technology in the late 1990s wasn't advanced enough to extract additional information from the limited samples that had been collected. John Vancees remained the primary person of interest in the case, but investigators had been unable to build a case strong enough for prosecution. He had hired an attorney and stopped cooperating with investigators, invoking his Fifth Amendment rights when questioned about his relationship with Jodi. His refusal to take a polygraph test had only increased suspicions, but it wasn't evidence of guilt that would hold up in court. The corruption story that Jodi had been investigating also led to several dead ends. While FBI agents had uncovered evidence of bid rigging and other irregularities in city government, they couldn't establish a direct connection to Jodi's disappearance. Several officials involved in the corruption scheme had resigned or been quietly transferred, but none had been charged with crimes related to Jodi's case. Detective Ron van der Weerd had become the public face of the investigation, regularly speaking to media outlets about the case and appealing for new information. But privately, he was struggling with the lack of progress. He had devoted years of his life to finding Jodi, following thousands of leads and interviewing hundreds of suspects and witnesses. The failure to solve the case was eating away at him personally and professionally. The Huisentruit family had established a foundation in Jodi's honor, providing scholarships for journalism students and supporting other missing person cases. But the foundation's work, while meaningful, couldn't fill the void left by Jodi's absence. Maurice and Joanne Huisentruit had aged dramatically during the years since their daughter's disappearance, and their marriage was showing signs of strain from the constant stress and uncertainty. The family had also become advocates for other families of missing persons, understanding better than most the unique agony of not knowing what had happened to a loved one. They worked with organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults, sharing their experience and helping other families navigate the complex world of missing person investigations. In Mason City, life had gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, though Jodi's disappearance had left permanent scars on the community. KIMT-TV had hired new anchors and moved on with their programming, but Jodi's absence was still felt by longtime viewers who remembered her warmth and professionalism. A memorial scholarship had been established in her name at her alma mater, ensuring that her legacy would continue even if the mystery of her disappearance remained unsolved. The media attention that had initially been so intense had also faded. While the case was still mentioned occasionally on anniversary dates or when similar cases made headlines, it was no longer front-page news. America's attention span had moved on to other tragedies and mysteries, leaving Jodi's story to join the ranks of unsolved cases that capture public imagination briefly, before being forgotten by all but those directly affected. This fading interest was particularly painful for Jodi's family, who felt that their daughter was being forgotten along with her case. They continued to do interviews whenever possible, trying to keep Jodi's story in the public consciousness. But they were fighting against the natural tendency of news cycles to move on to fresher stories and more recent tragedies. Law enforcement agencies had also begun to face criticism for their handling of the case. Some experts who reviewed the investigation files suggested that crucial evidence had been mishandled in the early stages, potentially compromising any future prosecution. The failure to immediately secure the crime scene had allowed potential evidence to be contaminated or destroyed. There were also questions about whether jurisdictional disputes between local, state, and federal agencies had hindered the investigation. While the different agencies had officially cooperated, there were reports of tension and competition that might have prevented the free flow of information that would have been optimal for solving the case. Despite these setbacks, Some investigators remained optimistic that the case could still be solved. Advances in DNA technology were making it possible to extract useful information from smaller and more degraded samples than had been possible in 1995. If physical evidence from Jodi's case had been properly preserved, it might yield new leads that could breathe life back into the investigation. There was also hope that someone with crucial information might finally come forward. Investigators knew that cases like Jodi's were often solved years later when witnesses decided to break their silence, either because of guilt or because changed circumstances made it safer for them to speak. The passage of time sometimes worked in favor of justice, even when it seemed to be working against it. Cold case units were becoming more common in police departments across the country, and there was discussion about forming a specialized unit that could take a fresh look at Jodi's case. New investigators, without the emotional baggage and preconceived notions that had developed over years of working the case, might see patterns or connections that had been missed. But for Jodi's family and friends, these possibilities offered only cold comfort. Each passing year made it less likely that they would ever learn the truth about what had happened to her. The hope that had sustained them through the early years of the investigation was being replaced by a grim acceptance that they might never have answers. The 4th anniversary of Jodi's disappearance passed with minimal media coverage and no new developments. The case that had once commanded national attention was becoming just another unsolved mystery, filed away in cabinets and computer databases, waiting for a break that might never come. As the calendar turned to the year 2000, Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance had become one of Iowa's most infamous unsolved cases. 5 years had passed since that June morning when she vanished from her apartment parking lot. And despite thousands of investigative hours and countless leads, her fate remained a mystery that haunted everyone who had known her. The new millennium brought renewed interest in cold cases, partly due to advancing forensic technology and partly because of popular television shows that highlighted unsolved mysteries. DNA analysis had become more sophisticated, and investigators across the country were re-examining old evidence with new tools that hadn't been available when crimes were first committed. For the Jodi Huisentruit case, this technological advancement offered a glimmer of hope. Evidence collected from her car and the surrounding area in 1995 was resubmitted for analysis using newer DNA techniques. While much of the physical evidence had been compromised by time and improper storage, investigators hoped that something useful might still be extracted. The reanalysis revealed partial DNA profiles that hadn't been detectable with 1990s technology. While the samples were too degraded to provide definitive matches, they did offer some new avenues for investigation. Most significantly, the DNA evidence definitively ruled out several early suspects who had remained under suspicion for years. John Vansis, however, was not among those cleared by the new evidence. In fact, some of the partial DNA profiles were consistent with samples that investigators had obtained from him early in the investigation, though not conclusive enough to support criminal charges. This development renewed law enforcement's focus on Vansis, who had maintained a low profile since the initial investigation had cooled. Investigators decided to take another run at Vansis, using the new DNA evidence as leverage to pressure him into providing more information. But when they approached him, they discovered that he had left Mason City several years earlier and was now living in Arizona. His departure from Iowa had been quiet, with few people even realizing he had gone. When investigators tracked Vansis down in Arizona, they found a man who appeared to have been worn down by years of suspicion and scrutiny. He agreed to another interview, but continued to maintain his innocence while providing few new details about his relationship with Jodi or the events surrounding her disappearance. The interview did reveal some new information that investigators found troubling. Vansis admitted that he had been in love with Jodi and had hoped their relationship would develop beyond friendship and professional collaboration. He acknowledged that his feelings for her had been stronger than he had initially admitted, but he continued to deny any involvement in her disappearance. More disturbing was Vancis's admission that he had destroyed personal items related to Jodi after her disappearance, claiming he had done so because they were too painful to keep. When pressed about what exactly he had destroyed, Vancis became evasive, saying only that they were personal mementos of their friendship. This revelation frustrated investigators, who realized the potentially crucial evidence might have been destroyed years earlier. If Vancis had kept items belonging to Jodi, they could have provided physical evidence linking him to her disappearance. His decision to destroy these items, whether motivated by guilt or grief, had eliminated what might have been the key to solving the case. The investigation also took a new direction when investigators decided to re-examine the corruption angle that had been explored earlier. While the initial investigation into city government irregularities hadn't yielded direct connections to Jodi's disappearance, advances in financial investigation techniques made it possible to trace money flows and relationships that hadn't been apparent in the 1990s. This new analysis revealed a more extensive network of corruption than had initially been suspected. Several Mason City officials and business leaders had been involved in schemes that had cost taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars. More importantly, investigators discovered that some of these individuals had known about Jodi's investigation and had been actively working to discredit her reporting. One particularly troubling discovery was that someone had been monitoring Jodi's phone calls in the weeks before her disappearance. Phone records showed patterns of unusual activity that suggested surveillance, though investigators couldn't determine who had been responsible for the monitoring or whether it was connected to her disappearance. The corruption investigation also revealed that several people who had been considered beyond suspicion in Jodi's case had actually had strong motives to prevent her story from being published. These individuals had the resources and connections that would have made it possible to arrange her disappearance without being directly involved in the crime itself. However, like so many aspects of the Jodi Huisentruit case, these new leads raised more questions than they answered. The corruption network was complex and far-reaching, making it difficult to determine which individuals might have been desperate enough to resort to violence to protect their secrets. As the investigation entered the new millennium, it had expanded far beyond the simple missing person case it had initially appeared to be. What had started as a search for a missing television anchor had uncovered a web of corruption, obsession, and small-town secrets that implicated some of Mason City's most prominent citizens. But despite all the new leads and technological advances, investigators still lacked the definitive evidence they needed to make arrests. The case remained frustratingly circumstantial, with multiple theories but no conclusive proof of what had happened to Jodi Huisentruit. For Jodi's family, the passage of time had brought a painful acceptance that they might never learn the complete truth about their daughter's fate. While they continued to hope for a breakthrough, they had also begun to focus on honoring Jodi's memory through charitable work and advocacy for other missing person cases. The Jodi Huisentruit Scholarship Fund had grown significantly over the years, helping dozens of young journalists pursue their dreams. In some ways, this positive legacy provided more comfort to the family than the ongoing investigation, which seemed to generate more questions than answers with each passing year. Mason City had also changed significantly since 1995. Many of the officials and business leaders who had been part of the corruption network had died, moved away, or retired. The city government had implemented new transparency measures, partly in response to the scandals that had been uncovered during the Jodi Huisentruit investigation, but the case continued to cast a shadow over the community. Long-time residents still remembered the chaos and suspicion of the late 1990s, when it seemed like anyone could be a suspect and nothing was as it appeared. The case had taught them that even small Midwest towns could harbor dark secrets and dangerous people. The advent of the Internet age brought new possibilities for solving cold cases, and the Jodi Huisentruit investigation was no exception. By 2005, a decade after her disappearance, online communities dedicated to unsolved mysteries had made Jodi's case one of their most discussed topics. Amateur investigators, armchair detectives, and true crime enthusiasts pored over every detail of the case, sometimes uncovering connections that professional investigators had missed. One of the most significant developments came from an unexpected source: social media connections that revealed previously unknown relationships between people involved in the case. As platforms like MySpace and later Facebook became popular, investigators were able to track relationships and communications between suspects and witnesses that had been hidden for years. This digital detective work revealed that several key figures in the Jodi Huisentruit case had maintained contact with each other long after the initial investigation had ended. Phone records and email communications showed ongoing relationships between people who had claimed to barely know each other when interviewed by police. Most notably, investigators discovered that John Vansis had been in regular contact with several other individuals who had been questioned about Jodi's disappearance. These communications, which spanned several years, suggested a level of coordination that raised new suspicions about a possible conspiracy to cover up what had happened to Jodi. The digital investigation also uncovered evidence that someone had been systematically destroying or altering online records related to the case. Websites that had contained information about the corruption investigation Jodi had been working on had been taken down or modified, and some individuals had gone to great lengths to scrub their online presence of any references to the case. This pattern of digital manipulation suggested that someone with significant resources and technical knowledge was still actively working to prevent the truth about Jodi's disappearance from being discovered. The scope of the cover-up effort indicated that the case involved more than just a single perpetrator acting alone. In 2007, the case received renewed media attention when an investigative journalist published a comprehensive analysis of all the evidence and theories that had emerged over the years. The book, which became a bestseller, argued that Jodi's disappearance was the result of a conspiracy involving multiple individuals who had been motivated by both the corruption story she was investigating and personal obsessions. The book's publication led to a flood of new tips and potential witnesses coming forward. Several people who had been afraid to speak during the initial investigation felt safer coming forward after so many years had passed. Their testimonies provided new insights into the relationships and motives that might have led to Jodi's disappearance. One particularly significant witness was a former KIMT employee who had left Mason City shortly after Jodi's disappearance. This individual provided detailed testimony about the toxic workplace environment at the television station and the inappropriate behavior of several male colleagues toward female employees. The witness specifically described John Vansis's obsession with Jodi as being far more intense and disturbing than had been publicly reported. The witness also revealed that Jodi had been receiving threatening messages in the weeks before her disappearance. These threats, which had been delivered both by phone and in writing, had warned her to stop her corruption investigation. Jodi had reported these threats to management at KIMT, but they had been dismissed as pranks rather than serious concerns. More disturbing was the revelation that some of these threats had contained specific details about Jodi's daily routine, including her apartment address and work schedule. This suggested that whoever was making the threats had been conducting surveillance on Jodi for an extended period before her disappearance. The new witness testimony also provided insights into the corruption network that Jodi had been investigating. The witness described a system of kickbacks and bid rigging that involved not only city officials, but also prominent business leaders and even some law enforcement personnel. The scope of the corruption was far broader than had been previously suspected, providing multiple potential motives for silencing Jodi permanently. Based on this new information, law enforcement agencies decided to form a joint task force to reinvestigate the case using modern techniques and resources. The task force included investigators from the FBI, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, and the Mason City Police Department, along with prosecutors who specialized in complex conspiracy cases. The task force's first priority was to re-interview all the key witnesses and suspects, using the new information that had emerged over the years. Many of these individuals had changed their stories multiple times since 1995, and investigators hoped that the passage of time and new evidence might finally pressure someone into telling the truth. John Van Cise, now in his 60s and living in Arizona, was brought back to Iowa for extensive questioning. Confronted with the new evidence about his communications with other suspects and the witness testimony about his behavior toward Jodi, Van Cise's lawyers advised him to continue invoking his Fifth Amendment rights. However, investigators were able to obtain search warrants for Van Cise's property in Arizona, where they discovered a cache of materials related to Jodi that he had claimed years earlier to have destroyed. These materials included photographs, personal items, and what appeared to be surveillance notes, tracking Jodi's activities in the weeks before her disappearance. The discovery of these materials provided the strongest physical evidence yet linking Van Cise to obsessive behavior toward Jodi. But even this evidence fell short of proving that he had been involved in her actual disappearance. Without her body or definitive proof of what had happened to her, prosecutors were still reluctant to bring charges based solely on circumstantial evidence. The task force also focused new attention on the corruption network, using financial analysis techniques that hadn't been available in the 1990s. This investigation revealed money flows and relationships that painted a clearer picture of who had been involved in the schemes that Jodi was investigating. Several individuals who had died since the original investigation were now identified as key players in the corruption network. While their deaths prevented them from being prosecuted or questioned, their involvement helped investigators understand the scope of what Jodi had been uncovering and why it might have been worth killing to prevent. The digital age investigation also benefited from advances in geographic analysis and cell phone technology. While cell phone tracking hadn't been available in 1995, investigators were able to use historical records and new analytical techniques to map the movements of various suspects during the crucial time period when Jodi disappeared. This analysis revealed some interesting patterns, including evidence that several key suspects had been in the vicinity of Jodi's apartment complex on the morning she disappeared, despite their claims to have been elsewhere. While this evidence was suggestive, it still wasn't conclusive enough to support criminal charges. As 2025 approaches, 30 years will have passed since Jodi Huisentruit disappeared from that Mason City parking lot on a June morning that changed everything. The case that began as a missing person investigation has evolved into one of America's most complex and enduring mysteries, touching on themes of obsession, corruption, media ethics, and the dark secrets that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly innocent communities. The investigation has consumed countless resources and destroyed several careers. Detective Ron van der Weerd, who devoted years of his life to finding Jodi, eventually retired without solving the case that had defined his professional legacy. FBI agents who worked the case have moved on to other assignments, but many still carry the frustration of leaving this mystery unsolved. John Van Cees, now in his late 70s, remains the primary person of interest in Jodi's disappearance. He has never been charged with any crime related to her case, though the evidence of his obsessive behavior toward her has been well documented. He continues to live quietly in Arizona, maintaining his innocence while refusing to cooperate with ongoing investigations. The corruption network that Jodi was investigating has been largely dismantled, with many of its key players having died or left public life. Some reforms were implemented in Mason City's government as a direct result of the scandals that were uncovered during the investigation into Jodi's disappearance. In some ways, her work as an investigative journalist continued to have impact long after she was gone. For Jodi's family, 3 decades of uncertainty have taken an immeasurable toll. Maurice and Joanne Huisentruit, who would now be in their 80s, have spent their entire later lives wondering what happened to their daughter. The foundation they established in her honor has helped numerous other families dealing with missing loved ones, but it cannot fill the void left by Jodi's absence. The case has also had a lasting impact on the journalism community, particularly female reporters who see in Jodi's story a reminder of the dangers they might face simply for doing their jobs. The Jodi Huisentruit Scholarship has supported dozens of young journalists over the years, ensuring that her commitment to the profession continues through others. Mason City has largely moved on from the events of 1995, though long-time residents still remember the chaos and suspicion that consumed their community during the height of the investigation. The city has grown and changed, but Jodi's disappearance remains part of its history, a dark chapter that can never be fully closed until the truth is known. Recent advances in DNA technology and digital investigation techniques continue to offer hope that the case might eventually be solved. Cold case units across the country regularly review the evidence, looking for new approaches that might finally provide the breakthrough that has eluded investigators for so long. In 2023, the most recent major development came when investigators announced they had identified several new persons of interest based on digital evidence and witness testimony that had emerged through social media and online cold case communities. While no arrests have been made, law enforcement officials expressed cautious optimism that these new leads might finally provide the answers that Jodi's family and the community have been seeking for decades. The case has also become a cautionary tale about the limitations of criminal investigations and the frustrating reality that not every crime can be solved, no matter how much resources and determination are applied to it. Despite having multiple suspects, numerous theories, and thousands of pieces of evidence, investigators have never been able to definitively prove what happened to Jodi Huisentruit. Some experts who have studied the case believe that it may never be fully solved unless someone with direct knowledge decides to come forward. The passage of time has eliminated many potential witnesses through death or memory loss, and physical evidence continues to degrade despite the best efforts to preserve it. Others remain optimistic that advancing technology will eventually provide the key to unlocking this mystery. DNA analysis continues to become more sophisticated, and new techniques for analyzing old evidence are constantly being developed. There is also hope that digital archaeology, the recovery and analysis of deleted or hidden electronic communications, might reveal crucial information that has been overlooked. The case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and television specials over the years, keeping Jodi's story in the public consciousness and generating new tips and theories. While most of these leads have not panned out, investigators continue to follow up on every credible piece of information, hoping that one of them might finally provide the breakthrough they need. For the amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who have made Jodi's case one of their primary focuses, the mystery continues to be a source of fascination and frustration. Online forums dedicated to the case remain active, with new theories and analyses being posted regularly. While some of this amateur investigation has been helpful, it has also generated numerous false leads and conspiracy theories that have complicated the official investigation. The media attention surrounding the case has also raised important questions about the ethics of covering unsolved crimes and missing person cases. While publicity can generate valuable tips and keep cases in the public eye, it can also traumatize families and interfere with ongoing investigations. The Jodi Huisentruit case has become a case study in balancing the public's right to know, with the need to protect both victims' families and the integrity of criminal investigations. As this story concludes, the central question remains unanswered. What happened to Jodi Huisentruit on that June morning in 1995? Despite 30 years of investigation, multiple theories, and thousands of hours of work by law enforcement professionals and amateur investigators alike, the truth remains as elusive as it was on that first day when her colleagues realized she was missing. The evidence suggests that Jodi was the victim of someone who knew her routine and had been watching her closely. Whether that person was motivated by obsession, by a desire to silence her investigative reporting, or by some combination of factors may never be known. What is certain is that a bright, talented young woman who was just beginning to make her mark on the world was taken from her family and community in an act of violence that has never been fully understood or properly punished. Jodi's story serves as a reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that even in small, seemingly safe communities, dangerous people can hide their true nature behind masks of respectability and normalcy. It also demonstrates the lasting impact that unsolved crimes have on families, communities, and the dedicated professionals who spend their careers seeking justice for victims. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Jodi Huisentruit's story. We'll see you in the next video. The morning anchor who never made it to work became a story that would outlast any news broadcast she might have delivered. In the silence of unanswered questions, Jodi Huisentruit's voice continues to call for justice, a reminder that some mysteries demand to be solved, no matter how much time passes or how cold the trail becomes.